She was sleeping in the tool shed with a baby blood dripped from Bridget Collins' trembling fingers onto the weathered floorboards of the abandoned tool shed as she clutched her newborn daughter closer to her chest, straining to hear if anyone had followed her through the storm. It was 1879 in the unforgiving territory of Wyoming, and the young widow had nowhere else to go after fleeing the man who'd promised her protection but delivered only cruelty. The baby whimpered softly, and Bridget pressed her lips against the infant's forehead. "Hush now, little Sarah," she whispered. "We'll be safe here just for tonight." The shed belonged to a ranch she'd spotted from the road, a desperate gamble, but the thunderstorm had left her no choice. Her dress was soaked through, her meager belongings stuffed into a single carpet bag that now served as a pillow for her child. At 22, Bridget had already endured more than most women twice her age. Widowed 6 months into her pregnancy when her husband's stagecoach was attacked, she'd accepted lodging from her husband's business associate only to discover his true intentions once she was vulnerable and with child. Tonight, she had finally gathered the courage to flee, waiting until her tormentor had drunk himself into a stupor before disappearing into the night. The tool shed was crude but dry. Old saddles hung from pegs, rusted tools lined the walls, and the scent of leather, oil, and hay permeated the small space. A threadbare horse blanket had become her bed, and as the storm raged outside, exhaustion claimed her. She fell into a fitful sleep, her arms wrapped protectively around her week-old daughter. Morning came with the creak of the shed door swinging open. Sunlight blazed through the entrance, silhouetting a tall figure. Bridget awoke with a gasp, instinctively shielding her baby. "This is private property," a deep voice stated matter-of-factly. The man stepped forward, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. As he moved from the blinding light into the dimness of the shed, Bridget could make out his features, a weathered face beneath the brim of a worn Stetson, a strong jaw darkened by stubble, and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. "I'm sorry," Bridget stammered, struggling to her feet while keeping her baby cradled against her. "We'll leave straight away. I just needed shelter from the storm." The cowboy's gaze took in the scene, the young woman with fear in her eyes, the infant wrapped in what appeared to be a torn petticoat, the small carpet bag that clearly contained all their worldly possessions, and the blood-stained blanket where they'd slept. "You're hurt," he observed, noting the crude bandage around her hand. "It's nothing," Bridget replied, backing away. The man's expression softened as the baby began to fuss. "This ain't fit for either of you," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "A tool shed's no place for a woman and child." Bridget's chin lifted defiantly. "We've had worse and we'll be gone before you know it." "I'm Samuel Blackwood," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "This is my ranch, and I'm offering you something better than my tool shed." "I don't accept charity from strangers," Bridget replied, though her legs trembled with exhaustion beneath her. "It's not charity, it's decency," Samuel countered. "My housekeeper could use help and you look capable enough." Bridget hesitated, studying the man before her. There was something in his direct gaze that spoke of honesty, but she'd been deceived before. "I'm Bridget Collins. This is my daughter, Sarah." She paused, weighing her limited options. "What sort of help does your housekeeper need?" Samuel replaced his hat. "Mrs. Abernathy's getting on in years. Could use someone younger to help with the washing, cooking, and such. There's a small room off the kitchen. It's yours if you want it for as long as you need." The baby began to cry in earnest now, her tiny face reddening with the effort. "She's hungry," Bridget said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Samuel nodded, turning toward the door. "I'll wait outside. When you're ready, the main house is just up the path, yellow place with the porch swing." When the door closed behind him, Bridget sank back down onto the blanket, her mind racing. She had planned to make her way to the nearest town, but with less than $5 to her name and a newborn to care for, the prospect of immediate shelter and work was tempting. Still, she'd learned the hard way that men rarely offered help without expecting something in return. After feeding Sarah and gathering her few possessions, Bridget emerged from the shed. Samuel Blackwood stood leaning against a fence post, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He straightened when he heard her approach. "I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood," Bridget said formally, "but I want to be clear I'm looking for honest work and a safe place for my daughter, nothing more." A flicker of something like respect passed across Samuel's face. "That's all I'm offering, Mrs. Collins, work and safety," he gestured toward the house. "Come along then, Mrs. Abernathy will be pleased to have the help." The main house was modest but well-maintained, with a wide porch and carefully tended flower beds that spoke of a woman's touch. As they approached, an older woman with iron-gray hair stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron. "Samuel Blackwood, who have you brought home this time?" she called, her tone suggesting this wasn't the first stray he'd collected. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Mrs. Collins and her daughter. They need a place to stay and you need help around the house. Seemed like Providence to me." The housekeeper scrutinized Bridget with sharp eyes that missed nothing the quality of her worn dress, the careful way she held her child, the wary expression that spoke of recent hardship. "Can you cook?" Mrs. Abernathy asked bluntly. "Yes, madam, and sew and clean and tend a garden." "And that little one, she going to be underfoot all day?" Bridget's arms tightened around Sarah. "She's just a week old, madam. She mostly sleeps, but when she's older I'll make sure she's no trouble." Mrs. Abernathy's face softened slightly. "Well, come in then. No sense standing in the yard all day. Samuel, bring in her things." The ranch house was clean and comfortable, with simple furnishings and practical touches. Mrs. Abernathy led Bridget to a small but tidy room off the kitchen, just as Samuel had described. "It's not much," the housekeeper said, "but it's warm and private." "It's perfect," Bridget replied honestly, taking in the narrow bed, the small dresser, and the window that looked out over a kitchen garden. "Get yourself settled," Mrs. Abernathy instructed. "There's a basin and pitcher on the dresser. Clean up and then we'll talk about your duties." Left alone, Bridget carefully laid Sarah on the bed and began to unpack her meager possessions, 2 dresses besides the one she wore. Undergarments, a hairbrush, a small Bible, her husband's pocket watch, and a tiny silver rattle that had been a gift from her mother. She washed the road dust from her face and hands, wincing as the water stung the cut on her palm. When she emerged, Samuel was seated at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, deep in conversation with Mrs. Abernathy. They fell silent when they noticed her. "Mrs. Collins, I've explained to Mrs. Abernathy that you'll be staying on as her helper," Samuel said. "Your wages will be $8 a month plus room and board for you and your daughter." It was a fair offer, more generous than Bridget had expected. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Samuel runs a decent establishment," Mrs. Abernathy added. "No drinking, no carousing. The men stay in the bunkhouse and they don't come bothering the main house unless invited." "How many hands do you employ, Mr. Blackwood?" Bridget asked. "Just 4 regular plus a couple seasonal when we need them. It's a small spread compared to some, but it's mine." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to attend to." After Samuel left, Mrs. Abernathy gave Bridget a more thorough assessment. "That hand needs proper tending," she observed. "Sit down and I'll fetch my medicine box." As the older woman cleaned and bandaged the cut, Bridget found herself relaxing slightly for the first time in months. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. "Going on 15 years now." "Came with the place when he bought it from old man Hargrove. Samuel was just a boy then, barely 20, but determined to make something of himself." Mrs. Abernathy tied off the bandage. "He's a good man, Mrs. Collins, honorable, you've no need to fear him." Bridget flushed. "I didn't mean to imply, no need to explain. I can see you've had reason to be cautious." The housekeeper's eyes were kind but knowing. "Your husband, is he?" "Dead," Bridget confirmed. "Indians attacked the stagecoach he was traveling on. That was 6 months ago." Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "And since then," Bridget looked away, "I've managed." "Well, you're here now, and that's what matters." Mrs. Abernathy stood. "Rest today, tomorrow's soon enough to start your duties." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Bridget stared at the ceiling, listening to her daughter's soft breathing. The room was small but clean, the sheets smelled of sunshine, and for the moment at least, they were safe. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd fled into the storm the previous night. She thought of Samuel Blackwood's steady gaze and straightforward manner. There had been no hint of the predatory interest she'd come to recognize and fear in men's eyes. Still, experience had taught her that appearances could be deceiving, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "We'll stay as long as it's safe," she whispered to her sleeping child, "and we'll save every penny. Someday we'll have a place that's truly ours." The next morning, Bridget rose before dawn, determined to prove her worth. She found Mrs. Abernathy already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread. "Good morning," Bridget said, settling Sarah in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. "What would you like me to do first?" Mrs. Abernathy gave her an approving look. "You can start by setting the table. The men will be in for breakfast soon." The routine of the ranch quickly became familiar. Bridget helped prepare meals, washed dishes and laundry, swept floors, and tended the garden. Sarah was an easy baby, content to sleep in her drawer cradle or to be carried in a sling Bridget fashioned from an old shawl as she worked. Samuel Blackwood was rarely in the house, spending most days out on the range with his men, returning only for meals and in the evenings. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but reserved, asking after her comfort and the baby's health but never prying into her past. 2 weeks after her arrival, Bridget was hanging laundry in the yard when she noticed Samuel by the corral, working with a young horse. She paused to watch as he moved with patient confidence, speaking softly to the nervous animal, his movements slow and deliberate. There was a gentle authority in his manner that gradually calmed the skittish colt. "He has a way with horses," Mrs. Abernathy commented, joining Bridget at the clothes line. "Always has, says they're like people respond better to kindness than force." "He seems a good man," Bridget admitted cautiously. "The best," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Lost his wife and child 7 years back. Fever took them both. He's kept to himself since then, pours everything into this ranch." Bridget glanced at the housekeeper in surprise. "I didn't know he was married." "Doesn't talk about it much. Some wounds don't heal, just scar over." Mrs. Abernathy handed Bridget another sheet to hang. "Their room's still as she left it, at the end of the hall. Hasn't changed a thing." The information cast Samuel in a new light. His reserved manner wasn't coldness but grief, carefully contained. Bridget found herself watching him more closely after that, noticing the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when he saw her with Sarah, the gentle way he'd touch the top of the baby's head when he thought no one was looking. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Bridget was sitting on the porch, rocking Sarah and singing softly when Samuel returned from checking the fences. He paused at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. "That's a pretty song," he said. "My mother used to sing it to me," Bridget replied. "It's one of the few things I remember about her. She died when I was young," Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My mother sang too, said music was God's way of giving us a taste of heaven." "Do you believe that?" "I used to." He climbed the steps and leaned against the porch railing. "These days, I'm not sure what I believe anymore." The honesty in his voice emboldened Bridget. "Mrs. Abernathy told me about your wife and child. I'm sorry for your loss." A muscle tightened in Samuel's jaw. "Alice and our son Thomas, he was just 3 months old." "It's a special kind of pain, losing someone you love," Bridget said softly. "My husband William, he wasn't perfect, but he was kind. He was so excited about the baby." Samuel's gaze settled on Sarah, who had fallen asleep in Bridget's arms. "She has your eyes." "And her father's chin," Bridget smiled, tracing a finger along her daughter's small face. "Stubborn, just like him." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle the only sounds. It was the first time since her arrival that they'd spoken of personal matters, and Bridget was surprised by how natural it felt. "Mr. Blackwood," she began hesitantly. "Samuel," he corrected. "After sharing confidences, it seems right you should use my given name." "Samuel," she amended. "I wanted to thank you for everything, not just the job and the room, but for not asking questions when you found us in your tool shed." "Some stories tell themselves, Mrs. Collins." "Bridget," she offered in return, "and what story did you read in us that morning?" Samuel considered her question. That you were running from something, or someone, that you were desperate enough to seek shelter in a stranger's shed with a newborn child, and that whatever you were running from was worse than the risk you took. His perception was unsettling in its accuracy. You saw all that. I've spent my life reading signs, weather patterns, animal tracks, the way the land lies. People aren't so different. Samuel straightened, replacing his hat. Whatever brought you here, you're safe now. As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Bridget found herself believing him. For the first time since William's death, she felt the faintest stirring of hope, not just for survival, but for the possibility of building something more. The summer progressed, bringing scorching days and the constant battle against dust that infiltrated every corner of the house, no matter how often Bridget swept. Sarah grew steadily, her curious eyes taking in the world around her, her tiny hands reaching for anything within grasp. Bridget settled into life at the ranch, finding satisfaction in the rhythm of daily chores and the security of regular meals, and a safe place to sleep. Her body recovered from the birth, growing stronger with proper food and rest. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, though she still startled at unexpected noises and kept a small kitchen knife hidden beneath her mattress. Samuel's men treated her with respectful distance, tipping their hats when they saw her and praising her cooking at mealtimes. Only one, a hired hand named Jenkins, made her uncomfortable with his lingering glances, but a quiet word from Samuel had quickly resolved the issue. The man was gone the next day, his place taken by a laconic older cowboy who barely spoke but nodded politely whenever their paths crossed. As the weeks passed, Bridget began to notice small changes in Samuel. He lingered longer at meals, occasionally joining her on the porch in the evenings, sometimes bringing a book to read aloud while she mended clothing or rocked Sarah. His initial reserve gradually gave way to a cautious friendliness that Bridget found herself looking forward to at the end of each day. One particularly hot afternoon in August, Bridget was struggling to hang the heavy, wet sheets on the line when Samuel appeared beside her. "Let me help with that," he offered, easily taking the weight of the damp linen. "Thank you," Bridget said, wiping perspiration from her brow. "I didn't realize laundry could be such an ordeal in this heat." Samuel smiled, a rare sight that transformed his serious face. "Wyoming summers are hard, but the winters are worse. You might want to consider that before you decide to move on." His words caught her by surprise. "Are you suggesting I stay through winter?" Samuel focused intently on securing the sheet to the line. "I'm suggesting you might want to consider making your arrangement here more permanent." He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Abernathy isn't getting any younger, and you've proven yourself capable. The place runs smoother with you here." It was the closest he'd come to asking about her future plans, and Bridget wasn't sure how to respond. She had been saving nearly all her wages, building a small nest egg that might eventually allow her to establish a more independent life for herself and Sarah. But the thought of leaving the security of the ranch and Samuel was increasingly difficult to contemplate. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "For now, I'm grateful for what we have here." Samuel nodded, accepting her non-answer. "There's a social at the church in town this Saturday. Thought you might like to attend, get to know some of the other women in the area." Bridget hesitated. Since arriving at the ranch, she'd avoided town, fearful that news of her whereabouts might reach the man she'd fled, but that fear was fading with time and distance. "I'd like that," she said finally, "if it wouldn't be too much trouble." "No trouble at all. We need supplies anyway." Samuel handed her another clothespin. "It would do you good to have more company than just Mrs. Abernathy and me." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a welcome cooling breeze. Bridget dressed in her best gown, a simple blue cotton that she'd carefully mended and pressed and arranged her hair in a neat twist. Sarah was bathed and dressed in a new gown that Mrs. Abernathy had fashioned from an old pillowcase, delicately embroidered around the edges. When Bridget emerged from her room, Samuel was waiting in the kitchen, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with his best vest. He stood when she entered, and something in his expression made her cheeks warm. "You look very nice," he said simply. "Thank you," Bridget replied, suddenly self-conscious. It's been a long time since I've been to a social gathering. Mrs. Abernathy bustled in from the pantry. You both look fit for Sunday service. Now go on before the best pies are taken. The ride to town was pleasant, with Samuel pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the early days of his ranching. Bridget found herself relaxing in his company, laughing at his dry humor and enjoying the simple pleasure of adult conversation. The church social was held in the yard behind the small white chapel that served the scattered community. Tables laden with food formed a semicircle, and lanterns hung from tree branches in preparation for when darkness would fall. A fiddle player was tuning up near an area cleared for dancing, and children darted between groups of conversing adults. Bridget felt a moment of panic as they approached the gathering, suddenly aware of how isolated she'd been. Samuel must have sensed her unease because he placed a reassuring hand at the small of her back. The minister's wife, Mrs. Dawson, is over there, he said, nodding toward a plump, pleasant-faced woman arranging plates. She's a kind soul. I'll introduce you, Mrs. Dawson proved to be exactly as Samuel had described, warm and welcoming, immediately cooing over Sarah and drawing Bridget into conversation with several other women. To Bridget's relief, they asked few questions about her past, seeming to accept Samuel's vague introduction of her as a relative of his late wife who had recently been widowed. As the afternoon progressed, Bridget found herself genuinely enjoying the company of other women after months of isolation. They shared recipes and child-rearing advice, complained good-naturedly about the challenges of frontier life, and treated her as one of their own. Samuel seems different, Mrs. Dawson commented as they watched him talking with a group of men near the lemonade table. More at ease than I've seen him in years. How so? Bridget asked, curious. After Alice and the baby died, he withdrew into himself, polite as always but distant, like he was living behind a wall. Mrs. Dawson patted Bridget's hand. It's good to see him coming back to life. You've been good for him. Bridget wanted to protest that she was merely an employee, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't deny that something had changed between them in recent weeks, a growing ease, a deepening connection that went beyond employer and servant. As dusk fell, the fiddle player struck up a lively tune and couples began to gather for dancing. Bridget sat with Sarah on her lap, watching the whirling figures with a smile, tapping her foot to the music. May I have this dance? Samuel appeared before her, hand outstretched. Bridget glanced down at Sarah. I can't leave the baby. I'll hold her, Mrs. Dawson offered immediately. Go on, enjoy yourself. With no excuse left, Bridget placed her hand in Samuel's and allowed him to lead her to the dancing area. It had been so long since she danced that she felt awkward at first, but Samuel was a surprisingly graceful partner, guiding her confidently through the steps. You dance well, Mr. Blackwood, she said, slightly breathless as they circled each other. My mother insisted all her sons learn, he replied with a small smile. Said a man who could dance would never lack for company. And did you find that to be true? Until tonight, I hadn't tested the theory in many years. His hand was warm at her waist as he guided her through a turn. But I'd say she might have been right. The simple compliment sent a flutter through Bridget's chest that she hadn't experienced since before William's death. It was a dangerous feeling, one that reminded her of her vulnerability and the precariousness of her situation. Yet in Samuel's steady gaze she found no threat, only a warmth that invited rather than demanded. As the music ended, Samuel reluctantly released her hand. Thank you for the dance, Bridget. Thank you for bringing me tonight, she replied. It's been healing to be among people again. They collected Sarah from Mrs. Dawson and made their goodbyes, loading their supplies into the wagon for the journey home. Sarah had fallen asleep, and Bridget cradled her close, grateful for the peaceful expression on her daughter's face. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Wyoming sky. Samuel drove steadily, occasionally pointing out constellations and sharing the stories his father had taught him about the night sky. Do you ever regret it? Bridget asked suddenly. Coming west, I mean. Building a life in such a harsh place. Samuel considered the question. There are days when the work seems endless and the land unforgiving. Days when I wonder if I was a fool to believe I could carve something worthwhile from wilderness. He glanced at her. But then there are moments of perfect sunset, the first green of spring, the satisfaction of seeing cattle fat on good grass that make the struggle worthwhile. Is that enough? Those moments? It has been. Samuel adjusted the reins until recently. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Bridget looked away, focusing on the dark landscape passing by, not trusting herself to respond. When they reached the ranch, Samuel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Bridget," he said softly. "Thank you for the company." "Good night, Samuel," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She hurried into the house, heart pounding with emotions she wasn't ready to name. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, replaying the events of the day, the warmth of Samuel's hand in hers as they danced, the quiet conversations under the stars, the way his eyes had followed her throughout the evening. It was dangerous to imagine anything beyond their current arrangement, yet she couldn't stop herself from wondering what it might be like to truly belong here, to build a future with this quiet, honorable man. But the past had a way of intruding on such dreams. In the darkest hours before dawn, Bridget remembered why she had fled, why she could never fully trust in the promise of safety. Harold Bennett, her late husband's business partner, would not have given up his search for her. A man of means and connections, with a reputation for never forgetting a slight, he would consider her escape a personal affront. The thought chilled her, driving away the warm glow of the previous evening. She drew Sarah closer, making a silent vow that no matter what happened between her and Samuel, she would never allow Bennett to harm her child. The following weeks brought a shift in the relationship between Bridget and Samuel. Nothing was spoken directly, but there were small changes, his hand brushing hers when passing the salt at dinner, lingering conversations on the porch after Sarah was asleep, a wildflower left on the kitchen table for the ladies of the house, as he'd put it with a shy smile, Mrs. Abernathy observed these developments with knowing eyes, but made no comment beyond an occasional satisfied nod. The old housekeeper had become increasingly dependent on Bridget's assistance, as her arthritis worsened with the approach of fall. And there was an unspoken understanding that Bridget's position in the household was evolving from employee to something more essential. September brought the first hints of autumn cooler mornings, the occasional golden leaf drifting from the cottonwoods by the creek. The ranch bustled with activity as Samuel and his men prepared for winter, repairing fences, stockpiling firewood, and making final arrangements for selling off the year's calves. One crisp morning, Bridget was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Samuel entered, earlier than usual and with an air of suppressed excitement. "I need to ride into Cheyenne for some business," he announced. "Thought you and Sarah might like to come along, make a day of it." Bridget looked up from the biscuit dough she was kneading. "Cheyenne, that's quite a journey." "We'd stay overnight at a hotel," Samuel added, a slight flush coloring his tanned face. "Separate rooms, of course. I just thought, well, you haven't been beyond the local town since you arrived. Might be nice to see something different." The invitation was tempting. Bridget had fond memories of Cheyenne from when she'd passed through with William on their journey west. The bustling territorial capital had shops and amenities that the small local settlement lacked. Mrs. Abernathy would need help with meals, she hedged, uncertain. "Already discussed it with her. Says she managed before you came and can manage for a day or two without you." Samuel smiled. "I think she's actually looking forward to having the kitchen to herself again." "Then yes," Bridget decided impulsively. "Sarah and I would love to accompany you." They set out the next morning in Samuel's best wagon, Sarah nestled in a basket padded with blankets between them. The journey would take most of the day, but the weather was perfect, clear skies with just enough breeze to keep the dust down. As the miles passed, Bridget found herself relaxing into the simple pleasure of traveling without fear, enjoying the changing landscape and Samuel's steady presence beside her. He was a good companion, knowledgeable about the land and its history, respectful of comfortable silences, and genuinely interested in her thoughts and observations. "What business takes you to Cheyenne?" she asked as they stopped to water the horses at a small creek. Samuel hesitated, busying himself with checking the harness. "Banking matters, mostly, and I need to speak with my lawyer about some property considerations." There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't being entirely forthcoming, but Bridget didn't press. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, a principle she deeply valued given her own secrets. They reached Cheyenne by late afternoon, the territorial capital sprawling before them with its mix of substantial brick buildings and hastily constructed wooden structures. The streets bustled with activity: freight wagons, cowboys, businessmen, and families all going about their business. Samuel guided the wagon to a modest but respectable hotel on a side street away from the saloons and gambling halls that dominated certain areas of town. "Wait here," he instructed, helping Bridget down before securing the horses. "I'll arrange for our rooms." Bridget stood on the boardwalk, Sarah in her arms, taking in the sights and sounds of the city. It was overwhelming after months of rural quiet, but also exhilarating. Shops displayed goods she'd almost forgotten existed: bolts of fine fabric, leather-bound books, delicate china, and glass bottles of perfume. Samuel returned looking pleased. "Everything's arranged. The hotel has a dining room, but I thought we might enjoy a meal at the cafe down the street. It's owned by a French couple, best food in Cheyenne." After freshening up in their respective rooms, they met in the hotel lobby. Samuel had changed into a clean shirt and his good coat, and Bridget had done her best with her limited wardrobe, putting on her blue dress and arranging her hair more carefully than usual. "You look lovely," Samuel said simply when he saw her. The cafe was small but elegant, with white tablecloths and real glass windows. The proprietor greeted Samuel by name, suggesting he was a regular customer on his infrequent visits to town. "Monsieur Blackwood, it has been too long," the man said, his accent thick but charming. His eyebrows rose appreciatively when he saw Bridget and Sarah. "And you bring guests? A special occasion?" "No, just a pleasant dinner, Pierre," Samuel replied, but there was a hint of something in his voice that made Bridget wonder. The meal was the finest Bridget had eaten in years: delicate soup, tender roast, and vegetables prepared with herbs she couldn't identify but thoroughly enjoyed. Sarah slept peacefully in her basket beside the table, undisturbed by the gentle murmur of conversation around them. Over dessert, a rich custard that melted on the tongue, Samuel seemed to grow more serious, even nervous. He fidgeted with his napkin, started sentences only to abandon them, and twice checked his pocket watch as if expecting something. "Is everything all right?" Bridget finally asked. "You seem distracted." Samuel took a deep breath. "Bridget, there's something I need to tell you, the real reason I wanted to come to Cheyenne." A cold fear gripped her heart. Had he discovered her secret? Had Harold Bennett found her? She forced herself to remain calm, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've been thinking about the future, about the ranch and what I want for it for myself." Samuel met her eyes directly. "When Alice died, I thought that part of my life was over. I threw myself into building the ranch, convinced it was all I had left. But then you came, you and Sarah, and I've begun to see possibilities I'd thought were closed to me forever." Bridget's breath caught as understanding dawned. "Samuel, please let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not a man of many words, and I've rehearsed this too many times to stop now." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "This belonged to my mother. I picked it up from the bank vault today." Opening it, he revealed a simple gold band set with a small, perfect pearl. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I know there are complications, things from your past that you haven't shared, but I want you to know that whatever they are, they don't change how I feel." Bridget stared at the ring, emotions warring within her: hope, fear, disbelief, and a fragile, newborn joy. "Samuel, you don't know what you're offering. What I've done, who might come looking for me, I know enough," he interrupted. "I know you're brave and resilient. I know you're a devoted mother. I know that in the months you've been at the ranch, you've brought light back into a place that had been dark for too long." He closed the box and placed it on the table between them. "Take time to think. The ring will wait until you're ready if you're ever ready." Tears welled in Bridget's eyes. "I don't deserve this, your kindness, your trust. That's not for you to decide," Samuel said firmly. "It's mine to give freely and without condition." The walk back to the hotel was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The small velvet box was tucked safely in Bridget's reticule, its weight seemingly disproportionate to its size. At the door to her room, Samuel paused. "Whatever you decide, nothing changes about your place at the ranch. That's your home for as long as you want it to be." Bridget nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She watched him walk down the hall to his own room before closing her door and leaning against it, overwhelmed by the evening's revelation. Sarah stirred in her sleep, tiny fingers flexing as she dreamed. Bridget gazed at her daughter, thinking of the future. She had envisioned a small house in some distant town where they might live modestly but independently, always looking over their shoulder for the threat of Harold Bennett's revenge. Samuel offered something different: a home, security, and most unexpectedly, love. The kind of love she had once shared with William, based on respect and genuine affection rather than possession or control. But accepting would mean putting Samuel at risk. Bennett was a vindictive man with resources and connections. If he found her when he found her, he would not hesitate to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Bridget removed the ring box from her reticule and opened it, the pearl gleaming softly in the lamplight. It was elegant in its simplicity, much like the man who had offered it. She slipped it onto her finger just to see how it might feel, surprised by how perfectly it fit. For a long moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future as Samuel Blackwood's wife, raising Sarah together, perhaps having more children, building a life on the land he loved so deeply. It was a beautiful vision, one that called to a part of her soul she'd thought long dead. With reluctance, she removed the ring and returned it to its box. The decision couldn't be made tonight, not when emotions ran so high. She needed to think clearly, to weigh the risks against the rewards, to consider what was best not just for herself but for Sarah and for Samuel. Morning came with no greater clarity. Over breakfast in the hotel dining room, Samuel was carefully casual, making no reference to the previous evening's proposal. Instead, he outlined plans for the day. He had business at the bank and with his lawyer, while Bridget was free to explore the shops or rest as she preferred. "I should be finished by early afternoon," he said. "Then perhaps we could stop for the night at the way station halfway home." "That sounds sensible," Bridget agreed, grateful for his consideration in not pressing for an answer. "I think I'll visit the mercantile. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned needing some special spices that aren't available in town." They parted on the hotel steps, Samuel heading toward the business district while Bridget, with Sarah securely in her arms, made her way to the main street of shops. The morning passed pleasantly as she browsed through merchandise unavailable in the small settlement near the ranch books. Fabrics, toys, and household goods that represented a level of civilization often missing from frontier life. At the mercantile, she was examining a bolt of calico when a voice behind her froze the blood in her veins. "Well, if it isn't the widow Collins, what a fortunate coincidence." Bridget turned slowly, instinctively clutching Sarah tighter. Harold Bennett stood just feet away, impeccably dressed as always, his silver-tipped cane tapping impatiently against the wooden floor. His handsome face wore the smile she had come to dread, charming on the surface, but with no warmth reaching his pale eyes. "Mr. Bennett," she acknowledged, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What brings you to Cheyenne?" "Business, my dear, always business." He stepped closer, ignoring her involuntary flinch. "Though I must admit, finding you has been a personal priority these past months." "You left rather abruptly without a proper goodbye." "I left a note," Bridget replied, glancing around for possible escape routes. The store was crowded with midday shoppers, providing some security in numbers but also blocking easy access to the door. "Ah yes, your charming note." "Thank you for your hospitality." Sarah and I must make our own way now, hardly adequate after all I did for you. Bennett's smile tightened. You embarrassed me, Bridget. People asked questions. Awkward questions about why my late partner's pregnant widow would flee in the night like a thief. I'm sorry if I caused you social discomfort, Bridget said, edging toward the counter where the shopkeeper stood. But as I said in my note, it was time for us to move on. Bennett's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with painful force. You're coming back with me, he hissed, all pretense of civility vanishing. I've spent too much time and money searching for you to leave empty-handed. Sarah began to cry, disturbed by her mother's tension and the stranger's harsh grip. Several shoppers turned to look, curiosity and concern on their faces. Let go of me, Bridget said loudly, drawing more attention. You're frightening my daughter. Bennett released her with obvious reluctance, smoothing his expression into one of concerned paternalism for the benefit of onlookers. Forgive me, my dear. It's just such a relief to find you safe after all this time. Your condition, when you left, had me terribly worried. The implication was clear. He was positioning himself as a concerned guardian rather than a predator. It was a role he played well, one that had initially fooled Bridget herself when William died. As you can see, we're perfectly fine, Bridget replied, her mind racing. She needed to find Samuel to warn him, to get Sarah away from this man who had haunted her nightmares for months. If you'll excuse me, I'm expected elsewhere. Bennett stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, but his voice followed her as she moved toward the door. We'll continue this discussion later, Mrs. Collins. I'm staying at the Cheyenne house. I'll expect you for dinner at 7. It wasn't an invitation, but a command, one that carried an implied threat. Bridget didn't respond, focusing instead on making her escape with as much dignity as possible. Once outside, she hurried down the boardwalk, fighting panic. Bennett was here in Cheyenne, and he had found her. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there he was, as determined as ever to possess what he considered rightfully his. She needed to find Samuel. His business had been with the bank and his lawyer, both likely located in the newer brick buildings several blocks away. Adjusting Sarah in her arms, Bridget set off in that direction, her heart pounding with each step. She was halfway there when a hand closed around her elbow, pulling her into the narrow alley between two buildings. Bridget opened her mouth to scream, only to find herself face to face with Samuel. "Bridget, what's wrong?" he asked, alarm evident in his expression. "You're white as a sheet." "He's here," she gasped, relief at finding him momentarily overwhelming her fear. "Harold Bennett. He found me in the mercantile." Samuel's face hardened. "Bennett, William's business partner." Bridget stared at him in shock. "How do you know about William, about Bennett?" "Later," Samuel said grimly. "First, we need to get you and Sarah somewhere safe. Did he threaten you?" "Not directly. He wants me to meet him for dinner at his hotel." Bridget shuddered. "Samuel, you don't understand. He's dangerous, powerful. He has friends in government, in law enforcement." "So do I," Samuel replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Come on. My lawyer's office is just down the street. We'll figure this out." Mr. Hollister, Samuel's lawyer, was a spare, serious man with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He listened without interruption as Bridget, at Samuel's urging, explained her history with Harold Bennett, how after William's death, Bennett had offered her a home as her husband's partner and friend, only to reveal his true intentions once she was dependent on his charity. He became possessive, Bridget said, choosing her words carefully. Said that William had owed him money, that I was now responsible for the debt. He suggested there were ways I could repay him. Samuel's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, allowing her to tell her story at her own pace. When I refused, he became angry, said no one would believe me if I complained that he was respected in the community while I was just a penniless widow. Bridget swallowed hard. After Sarah was born, things got worse. He started talking about how he would raise her as his own, how he would decide her future. That's when I knew I had to leave. And you fled in the night, Mr. Hollister concluded. Found your way eventually to Mr. Blackwood's ranch. Yes, I had no plan beyond getting away. When Samuel found us in his tool shed, I expected to be turned away or worse. Bridget glanced at Samuel, gratitude in her eyes. Instead, he offered us shelter, work, dignity. Mr. Hollister removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. Mr. Bennett's reputation precedes him. He's known to be vindictive toward those who cross him. He looked at Samuel. You understand what you're involving yourself in? I do, Samuel replied without hesitation. And my question remains the same. How do we protect Bridget and Sarah from this man? The lawyer considered for a moment. There are legal avenues, but they take time. In the immediate term, your best protection may be social rather than legal. Meaning, Bridget asked. Meaning that Mr. Bennett's power derives largely from his social standing. He's careful to maintain a veneer of respectability. Mr. Hollister replaced his glasses. If Mrs. Collins were to have the protection of another name, a respected name in the territory, it would complicate his efforts considerably. Samuel's eyes met Bridget's across the room. Marriage, he said softly. Is that what you're suggesting, Hollister? It would establish clear legal protection. As a married woman, Mrs. Collins would be under her husband's legal protection, making any claims Bennett might assert more difficult to pursue. The lawyer shrugged. Of course, there are other considerations beyond the legal ones. Bridget felt the weight of the velvet box in her reticule. What had been offered as a declaration of love now presented itself as a practical solution to her most pressing problem. The irony was not lost on her. I need to speak with Samuel alone, she said quietly. Mr. Hollister nodded, gathering some papers. I'll step out to file these documents. Take all the time you need. When the door closed behind him, silence fell between them. Sarah had fallen asleep in Bridget's arms, her peaceful expression a stark contrast to the tension in the room. I won't hold you to it, Samuel finally said. The proposal, not under these circumstances. Bridget met his gaze directly. Is that why you asked me to marry you, because you knew about Bennett, about my past? No, Samuel replied firmly. I asked because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you and Sarah. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I've known about Bennett for weeks. One of my men recognized your name, remembered hearing about William Collins and his widow. It wasn't hard to piece together the rest. And you didn't say anything? It wasn't my place to force your confidence. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. Samuel moved to kneel before her chair, taking her free hand in his. Bridget, I meant every word I said last night. This changes nothing about how I feel or what I'm offering. Tears filled Bridget's eyes. But it changes everything about why I might accept. Don't you see? If I marry you now, it will always be tainted by the need to escape Bennett rather than a free choice made from love. Then don't decide now, Samuel said gently. We'll find another way to deal with Bennett. When he's no longer a threat, when you're truly free to choose, I'll ask again. Bridget stared at him in wonder. Here was a man offering her protection with no conditions, willing to face a powerful enemy on her behalf, yet still concerned primarily with her freedom to make her own choices. It was everything Harold Bennett was not. In that moment, clarity came. Ask me again, she whispered. Samuel blinked in surprise. What? Ask me again. Right now. Bridget's voice strengthened. Not because of Bennett, not because of danger, but because life is uncertain and I don't want to waste another day pretending I don't know my own heart. Slowly, Samuel withdrew the velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal the pearl ring. Bridget Collins, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you build a life with me, raise our children together, share my home and my name for all the days we're granted? Yes, Bridget said simply. Yes, I will. The transformation in Samuel's face from tension to pure joy was something Bridget knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her lips, careful not to disturb the sleeping Sarah between them. When Mr. Hollister returned, they presented him with their decision. The lawyer's practical nature reasserted itself as he outlined the next steps. We can have the marriage license issued today. Judge Wilson is a friend. He'll perform the ceremony without delay. By dinner time, Mrs. Collins will legally be Mrs. Blackwood. He looked at Bridget. I suggest you keep your appointment with Mr. Bennett, but not alone. As a married woman accompanied by your husband, the dynamic will be quite different. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The marriage license was obtained, the judge summoned, and by 5 o'clock that afternoon, Bridget stood in the small courthouse with Sarah in her arms and Samuel at her side, exchanging vows that transformed her from a fugitive widow to a rancher's wife. There had been no time for a wedding dress or flowers, no guests beyond Mr. Hollister and the judge's clerk as witnesses. Yet as Samuel slipped the gold band onto her finger to join the pearl engagement ring, Bridget felt a sense of rightness that transcended the hasty circumstances. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Wilson declared, closing his Bible with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Blackwood, you may kiss your bride." Samuel's kiss was gentle but firm, a promise of protection and partnership that brought fresh tears to Bridget's eyes. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, testing the sound of her new name. "It has a nice ring to it," Bridget replied, managing a watery smile. They returned to the hotel to prepare for the confrontation with Bennett. Samuel insisted on accompanying Bridget to the dinner meeting, a plan that Mr. Hollister had strongly endorsed. "Remember," the lawyer advised as they parted outside the courthouse, "Bennett values his reputation above all. He won't risk a public scene, especially not with a respected rancher like Samuel. Stay in public areas, maintain composure, and make it clear that any threat to either of you will be met with legal and social consequences." As 7 o'clock approached, Bridget, dressed in her blue gown, now adorned with a lace collar Samuel had purchased from a shop near the courthouse, something new, he'd said with a smile. The pearl ring gleamed on her finger, accompanied now by the simple gold band that marked her as Samuel's wife. Sarah, fed and content, was settled in the hotel room under the watchful eye of the hotel manager's wife, a grandmotherly woman who had cooed over the baby and shooed the newlyweds on their way with good-natured efficiency. "Ready?" Samuel asked as they prepared to leave for the Cheyenne House, the city's most prestigious hotel. Bridget took a deep breath, drawing strength from his steady presence. "As ready as I'll ever be." The Cheyenne House dining room was elegant, with crystal chandeliers and white-clothed tables spaced for privacy. Harold Bennett was already seated when they arrived, his back to the entrance as he perused the wine list. He did not immediately notice their approach, giving Bridget a moment to study the man who had haunted her nightmares. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a cold way, expensively dressed, radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Yet now, with Samuel beside her and the weight of a wedding ring on her finger, Bennett seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," Bridget said clearly, drawing his attention. Bennett looked up, his practiced smile freezing when he saw Samuel standing protectively at Bridget's side. "Mrs. Collins, I wasn't expecting company." "It's Mrs. Blackwood now," Samuel corrected, pulling out a chair for Bridget before seating himself. "The ceremony was this afternoon." Bennett's face went through a series of rapid transformations: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a mask of polite interest. "How unexpected and hasty, one might almost suspect a certain urgency. When you find the right person, why wait?" Samuel replied evenly. "But then, you wouldn't know about that, would you, Bennett?" A flash of genuine anger crossed Bennett's face before he controlled it. "I must congratulate you, Blackwood. You've acquired a lovely wife. Although I'm curious, did she mention her outstanding obligations to me before you tied the knot?" "There are no obligations," Bridget said firmly. "William left no debts to you or anyone else. Any claims you think you have were invented to control me." Bennett leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing murmur. "You ungrateful little—" "I'd choose my next words very carefully if I were you," Samuel interrupted, his tone conversational but with steel beneath it. "My wife has shared the full history of your relationship. Any further harassment, any attempts to contact her or Sarah will be met with the full force of the law." "The law," Bennett scoffed. "You overestimate your influence, rancher. I have friends in every courthouse from here to Denver." "So does my lawyer," Samuel countered. "Mr. Hollister has prepared a detailed affidavit of Bridget's experiences in your household. It makes for compelling reading, the kind that newspapers might find interesting should anything happen to either of us. The color drained from Bennett's face. You're bluffing. Test me, Samuel invited softly. See what happens. A tense silence fell over the table. Bennett's eyes darted between them, calculating odds and outcomes with the precision of a gambler. This isn't over, he finally said, rising from his chair. People like you don't win against people like me, not in the long run. We already have, Bridget replied, finding courage in Samuel's unwavering support. Goodbye, Mr. Bennett. I sincerely hope this is the last time our paths cross. Bennett stared at her for a long moment, hatred and thwarted desire warring in his expression. Then, with a curt nod that might have been acknowledgement or threat, he turned and strode from the dining room. Bridget released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Do you think he'll really leave us alone? Men like Bennett are cowards at heart, Samuel said, taking her hand across the table. They prey on those they perceive as weak. When faced with determined opposition, they usually back down. He squeezed her fingers gently. But we'll be vigilant, just in case. They dined quietly, both processing the confrontation and its implications. Halfway through the meal, Samuel looked up with a rueful smile. This isn't exactly the wedding dinner I would have planned for you, he said. Bridget returned his smile, feeling lighter than she had in months. It's perfect. We're together, Bennett is gone, and Sarah is safe. What more could I ask for? Perhaps a proper honeymoon, Samuel suggested. We could stay another day in Cheyenne, see the sights, enjoy being newlyweds before heading back to the ranch. The thought was tempting, but Bridget shook her head. I'd rather go home, our home. That's where we'll build our life together, not in some hotel room in the city. Samuel's eyes warmed at her words. Home it is, then. They left Cheyenne the next morning, Sarah bundled securely between them in the wagon. The journey that had begun with uncertainty 2 days earlier now felt like the first steps of a new adventure. Bridget watched the landscape roll by, the vast Wyoming plains stretching to meet the distant mountains, and felt a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. What are you thinking? Samuel asked, noticing her contemplative expression. That sometimes the most unexpected paths lead us exactly where we need to be, Bridget replied. When you found me sleeping in your tool shed with Sarah, I thought it was the lowest point of my life. Instead, it was the beginning of everything good. Samuel smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. I knew at the moment I saw you fierce as a mother bear despite being half-starved and scared. I thought to myself, Samuel Blackwood, that woman's going to change your life. Is that why you said it wasn't fit for either of us, the tool shed? Partly, Samuel admitted. But mostly because it was true. You deserved better than a dirt floor and rusty tools for neighbors. You both did. They reached the halfway point by sunset, stopping at the way station where they'd planned to spend the night. Unlike the hotel in Cheyenne, the accommodations were rustic, a single room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and little else. I can sleep in the wagon, Samuel offered, aware of Bridget's potential discomfort with their new intimacy. Bridget considered him for a moment. This man who had rescued her, protected her, married her, and now stood ready to sleep under the stars rather than pressure her in any way. How different he was from Harold Bennett, who had seen her only as something to possess. No, she said softly, stay with me, with us. That night, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer provided by the station keeper's wife, Bridget and Samuel shared their first night as husband and wife. His touch was gentle, his patience infinite as they discovered each other with the wonder of new lovers who had already built a foundation of trust and respect. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms as moonlight filtered through the crude curtains, Bridget felt a sense of peace she had thought lost forever. I love you, she whispered, the words coming naturally now that the last barriers between them had fallen. I think I have since that first morning when you found us and offered help instead of judgment. Samuel's arms tightened around her. And I've loved you since I saw you stand up in that tool shed, ready to protect your child against any threat, even when you had nothing left to give. He pressed a kiss to her temple. "We're going to build a good life, Bridget, for us, for Sarah, for any other children who might come along." "I'd like that," Bridget murmured, sleep beginning to claim her. "A house full of children growing up strong and free on the ranch." "Just like their mother," Samuel agreed, his own voice heavy with contentment. They returned to the ranch 2 days later to find Mrs. Abernathy waiting on the porch, arms crossed and expression severe until she spotted the rings on Bridget's finger. Then her face transformed, years seeming to fall away as she hurried down the steps to embrace first Bridget, then a startled Samuel. "About time," the housekeeper declared, wiping tears from her eyes. "Thought I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar before you figured it out." Life settled into a new pattern in the weeks that followed. Bridget continued to help with household duties, but now as the mistress of the ranch rather than an employee. Samuel added her name to the property deeds and bank accounts, making her truly his partner in all things. News of their marriage spread quickly through the scattered community. The minister's wife organized a belated wedding celebration at the church, where Bridget was formally introduced as Mrs. Samuel Blackwood. The women who had welcomed her at the social now embraced her as one of their own, offering friendship and support that helped heal the wounds of her isolation. As winter descended on the ranch, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland, Bridget found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place. From the desperate young widow sleeping in a tool shed with her newborn to the confident rancher's wife she had become, it seemed almost like a dream. Yet it was real as Samuel's love, as tangible as Sarah's growing strength, as enduring as the land that had become her home. The shadow of Harold Bennett receded with each passing day until he became little more than a distant memory, a trial overcome on the path to happiness. One evening in early December, as snow fell softly outside the windows, Bridget sat in the rocking chair before the fire, Sarah sleeping in her arms. Samuel entered quietly, brushing snow from his coat before hanging it by the door. "The stock's all settled for the night," he reported, crossing to warm his hands at the hearth. "Storm's picking up, but we're ready for it." Bridget smiled up at him, this man who had become the center of her world. "I have news," she said softly. Samuel knelt beside the rocking chair, his expression curious. "What kind of news?" "The kind that means we should start thinking about adding another room to the house." Bridget took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Sarah's going to be a big sister come summer." The joy that bloomed on Samuel's face was all the confirmation Bridget needed that she had found her true home at last. Not in a place, but in the love of a good man and the family they were building together. "I was right that morning," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion as he gathered her and Sarah into his embrace. "That tool shed wasn't fit for either of you. But this," he gestured to encompass the warm room, their sleeping daughter, the life growing within her, "this is exactly where you belong." Bridget leaned into his strength, grateful for the unexpected path that had led her to this moment. "Yes," she agreed simply. "This is exactly where I belong." And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the Wyoming wilderness in pristine white, the Blackwood family remained warm and secure in the home they had created, a home built not just of wood and stone, but of courage, second chances, and love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances.